Hey everybody, and welcome back to our scenario playthrough series. We are on scenario number 13 of the original RCT. This is Mel's World. Our goal is to get 1,200 guests into the park by October year 3 with a park rating of at least 600. The park brief says that we are given several well-designed modern rides to work with and build our park. We're going to question that a little bit. I'm not entirely sure how well designed these are when we consider our goals of this series of trying to build semi-realistic stuff with a decent eye to some real life inspiration. Neither of these coasters do a very good job at it, but we'll make some changes to help those out. We've also got a couple of nice flat rides there, which do help. I've always loved that subterranean S&S tower there and the top spin right next to it. Size-wise, the park's pretty darn big, so we're not going to be hurting for room. And in general, the layout is, or the landscape is fairly easy to work with. Got a pretty decent collection of rides to start. Need some thrill rides because we don't have too much else to work with there. But before we can really adjust these rides, we need to build some new stuff. So we are going to adjust our costs for these so we can start to bring in some dough. And then we'll get going on the rest of it. This is one of the nice scenarios that we actually have shops and stalls and things already in place. So we don't have to worry about that, although we will add some more a little bit later on. But for once, we actually have, shops and staff members and all that kind of thing. We'll place our carousel right here at the front. We really don't have a space for a big statement entry plaza, but this big kind of downward slope pathway from the entrance is sort of cool because you can kind of imagine yourself walking in, looking over top of the carousel out towards that big inverted coaster and off to the rest of the park. So it's probably a pretty cool view, I would think. So we'll put that carousel there as an entry statement, and then of course we always place the scrambler second, just because it gets us some rides and gets them all situated in. We got this nice little plateau on top of this hill, so that seems like a good place to put it. We can kind of stick it here and maintain that tree line hedge there, which actually I feel like this park always had very nice kind of pathway decor, and really it's just a couple of different hedges in different rows, but it just looks nice to me. And I always did like the pathway interactions with not only the launch tower there, but also the bobsled coaster as well, and that little section there in the rocky area of the invert. It's kind of a nice little setup, I think. So our first track ride here is going to be this car ride, and as it turns out, we probably built this too short for the minimum thresholds to not get a stat penalty. Even though it was not awful of a layout, I feel like it does some tunnels, does some elevation change and all that. The rating stayed really, really low the entire time despite scenery, and very few people rode it. I think at the time we beat the scenario, maybe there were 20 or 30 riders in total for the entire 3 years. So not so good, but hey, it gets us some people, and all we really need at this point are people coming through the gate. So I'm going to get a little funky here with the queue, only to immediately solve that here and make it a little more normal in just a little bit. But we're going to start out with the sports cars here and prep ourselves to connect to this pathway as well. Since we're kind of building off of that side by the invert, we want to connect this across, so we create a loop of path. In general, I like to avoid pathway dead ends if possible, so we're going to connect this through the hillside here, kind of matching some of the similar things on the other side. So now this park layout is effectively 3 big circles. So I think that's probably a decent way to start. Now we've got our car ride here, and we can theme it up a little bit. Of course, fencing is our primary means of theming, and that hedge fence always works fairly well, as do the topiaries and some of these sculptures and statues and things like that. So it's fairly straightforward stuff. I'm going to go pick one of the trees that's there in the back just to make sure that we can keep the same type of foliage throughout. So I generally like to steal whichever trees are kind of sitting there in the forest and everything, just to make sure that we have consistency across the board. So we'll get a couple of those various trees, give a couple little different colors, add some flowers and topiaries and bushes, and then where it's dense in the forest, we'll go for the dirt and grass, because I typically like to use dirt and grass more than anything compared to just regular grass. To give this area a little bit of critical max, we'll put another ride here so we kind of cluster these together. This kind of back corner seemed like the right place for a haunted house, so we will do that. and we'll adjust the landscape a little bit. This little depression there in the landscape seemed like a good spot for a small little pond, which then led to, hey, why don't we expand the pond? And that means we got to readjust all of these pathways we just built. So we're going to not drown that person, and then we're going to adjust this whole thing, including the queue, making it slightly more boring. Not that we needed a queue for that car ride, as I've already explained, but this allows us to get a slightly larger lake, and I feel like this is sort of a cool approach to this haunted house, kind of looking across the small pond. I guess you can barely call it a lake, but a small pond as you look across to this haunted house, which I feel like is kind of a neat look, perhaps. So that's where we went with it. I went ahead and changed the vehicle type to racing cars on the car ride, just because at the time I hadn't really realized why nobody was riding it, but clearly it is the stat penalty. Now we're going to use our spooky tree. We already have our spooky fence, as we have already talked about, and our spooky bush, but now we have a spooky tree, which I always feel like this tree, for whatever reason, kind of constitutes the overall spooky look, but ducks on the entrance because that seems like the right thing to do. So we'll raise up this little section of pathway here just because we are right down by the water, and I typically like to avoid that if we can. Make ourselves a little plaza here, and we are good to go. So this area is now built out fairly nicely, and it has a couple of attractions to bring guests across to the side. Got some food and drink on there, and we're all set. So this section right here is probably the largest flat section in the park to work with, and it was suggested in chat that maybe we do a junior wooden coaster and make this sort of like a kids area with a couple of like family rides and things. So we are going to do something of similar nature to that. And what better family wooden coaster than some kind of a figure eight type version here. So this is going to take a little bit of a time, and I left in the whole thing so you guys can see the iterative process of making these coasters. Sometimes these take a short amount of time and they just kind of click, and sometimes they don't, and this one definitely did not. The thing that I was trying to avoid is having the initial right-hand turn off of the lift hill and then a bunch of left-hand corners to basically finish up. So we're going kind of the opposite direction as the station now. And we need to circle back around and connect to the station, but it doesn't really make sense for how to do that because we're right next to the station platform. So we want to try, if we can, to stack things very nicely underneath of the upper portion. But it doesn't always work that way, and ideally you'd loop around again and then kind of connect it up in some different way, but that doesn't quite work like that, and our clearances are not super friendly in this case. So you can see we're trying a whole bunch of different things. The other thing to think about is how do you get your entrance and your exit in there? And that was why we're dipping kind of down below grade here for a little bit, so we can fix all of that. I do like that little bit of a double down there for that drop, so kind of an interesting drop there in the middle. So trying a couple of different things here, like this crossover move here where we can kind of give ourselves that complete figure of eight, but it doesn't really work because the length of the coaster is kind of squat, so it's a little bit hard to not only do that S-bend after the drop, but then correct it and kind of follow the path of the bends up above to go back the other direction. So you can kind of see here what we're trying to do to get this to circle around again. We can kind of barely get underneath that first drop there, and just trying to think, is this the right way to go about it? And sometimes you kind of just have to go with, you only have one or two options to work with, so it's just you try different things, and after a while you just got to be settled with it. And sometimes it works out and it looks good, and sometimes it doesn't, and you maybe aren't totally satisfied with it. And I think this was sort of the case with this one here, but you would think a simple small layout like this would be relatively straightforward, but clearly not. But that's part of the fun of the game, I think, is trying to get layouts that look alright, even though sometimes it's a little bit of a struggle. In the end, we did go with the left-hand turn, so basically we're making a racetrack here where we're just doing a bunch of laps. But we got 2 laps out of it, and we did get at least the diagonal drop, so we got something going on in there. You can see I kept with this lowered section here so we can get ourselves a station. and then we can kind of back that area up with a little tunnel there before the drop or the lift itself. We do, because there's really no place for brake run, we're going to use a single train on this, which is fine for a kids type family coaster like this. Entrance and exit on the same side too, which is not ideal, but at the same time, it's a single train thing. It's a small coaster, so we can probably deal with that, and I think it's probably okay. So we're going to do a little kind of pathway layout here with a couple of circles there connected up. Add ourselves an on-ride photo so we can at least generate a little bit of revenue, and I hid that as best as possible because I really just don't like the look of the on-ride photo. Do a little bit of land raising there for some tunnels, and now we are all set with our little family wooden coaster here, which took quite a while to build. And that's the trouble with the scenario, is because you want to balance that really perfectionist type detail on coaster layout design with actually having a time limit. So, we only have 3 years to work with on this, which isn't a lot. I feel like we had not really been struggling for any of these, but as we get further on into the more challenging scenarios, we can't spend too much time kind of screwing around with layouts. But with this one, we can do a little bit, so I feel like we did an appropriate amount of time for it. So as we temporarily move away from that area, we're going to build ourselves a swinging ship over on this side, and there's really not a good way to connect this just because of the landscape, so we're going to kind of carve out a section on this hillside, which I feel like looks alright. Kind of have that balance of things carved out from the hillside versus the sections there would have a little bit of supports on it, so I think that looks kind of nice. Do a little bit of landscaping around here, kind of along the lines of what we would typically see with our swinging ships, so using some of that rock, using some of the dark bushes, and of course that mesh fence. So it kind of has a little bit of a nautical theme. We'll also carry over this bush, common yew tree on that, and I feel like it fills that area out fairly nicely. So next up is a miniature railroad, and I don't usually build a lot of these just because typically they're fairly expensive, and usually I use them as a transport ride. But in this case, we're not. So we're going to use this as just a scenic single station type ride, and we're going to fill in this area here underneath of the plateau. You can kind of see our little starting here where we're using some of the small corners and everything just because we want to fit it in there very nicely. Looking at a little bit of elevation change initially, doing it underground so you don't have to look at it. And you know how much I don't like elevation change if you watched any of these videos on monorails, on trains, on any of these kind of transport rides that typically wouldn't have them. So we're going to cut underneath that wooden coaster there. We're going to give ourselves a little tunnel on the other side, and then we're going to come back around and connect up, and then realizing that the section that's right next to the station isn't going to work because we still got to get our station exit and entrance in there. So we're going to move this section over just a little bit and connect it up, and there we have it. So not a very big ride, but doesn't need to be. That's not really the goal. And connect up our queue right here and the exit on the other side. That's convenient. You'll just connect straight to the pathway. And then we can hide most of that station underneath of the hillside as well, which is kind of nice. Single train is all we need, just as large of a train as we can get. I've never really liked a bunch of trains on a small layout, especially just because you typically wouldn't see that. So here we get a fairly long miniature railway, which is nice on a relatively short course, but nonetheless I think it worked out okay. And now we can raise up the landscape over here just to get rid of this kind of excess of wood supports and everything and just make it feel a little bit more natural. I think that's okay. We're also going to set up to bring our pathway down from that upper plaza and eventually connect it over to the swinging ship. So to add in here a little bit of theming, we have our fencing and everything that we would typically do, and then a lot of this needs trees and things like that. First, we got to clean up our paths because there's a lot of litter and throw up on the paths. As it turns out, all of these fairly intense rides that we started with are not super helpful for cleanliness, which is fair. But here we go, adding in some landscaping, a couple trees, and a couple bushes and things just to make it slightly more interesting to go see things on this train layout. It would be cool, and I know you can do it with hacking, but it would be neat if you were able to adjust the top speed of the train, because I would probably turn it down just a little bit to make it a longer layout and just a kind of a slower experience, because I always feel like the train is fairly speedy when it gets up to full tilt. But That's sort of the same way as the monorail too, if I'm being honest, but I would like to be able to slow it down, kind of like you can do with the chairlift, but it is what it is. Alright, so now we get into modifying Flightmare, our coaster here. So we're going to go for a B&M style layout, because this is B&M style track, even though it's 2 across trains, so I guess technically it is a Giovanola. There's a few issues with this coaster to begin with, actually a lot of issues. First one being that just giant dip down towards the water. We're going to replace that with a 0G roll. And then we're going to reverse that section that dips down into the rock there, so we kind of have this steep diving corner into that Immelman coming out of the hillside. I wanted to generally keep that element because it's fairly iconic, and I thought it would look good. We are going to get rid of that low roll that's low to the ground there. I mean, I guess Banshee does this low roll, although that's one of my least favorite elements on an inverted coaster, so we are absolutely going to get rid of that. But we'll throw a corkscrew in a little bit later, and then we're also going to get rid of this ending bit where it dives underneath the pathway, which admittedly that is fairly cool, but then you have this weird finishing point with a lift hill piece and some other stuff that just really doesn't look good. But here's a good way to finish it up with a helix that comes up into that corkscrew, or I guess a flat spin, and then connects up to the station, and get rid of a lot of those station pieces and give ourselves a proper brake run. And then we are in good shape there. Now at the front of the layout, we're going to raise up our loop just a little bit and add some space pieces in there and give ourselves a typical B&M style pre-drop there. And the lift hill will extend just a little bit, and we can shorten up our station even further. So now we have a proper brake run. So now we just got to connect to the middle bit here. So I was pretty happy with the curve off of the 0G roll down below. And the idea here is to kind of intertwine with this vertical or very steep curving drop with a flat spin up top, and then diving down underneath of this diagonal bit and then up into that section that we've just built. For whatever reason here, it just did not want to line up and kind of work right. So it spent a fair bit of time trying to get this thing just right, but in the end it worked okay. A couple of little flat pieces in there, but not awful, and I think in general I'm pretty happy with how this layout turns out. It feels fairly realistic with what we've got to work with. You really don't have a lot of B&Ms in this original game, which is sort of interesting, that you have a lot of different coaster types, but weirdly it's just the vertical drop coaster as the B&M representation, and then this invert option that only pops up in this one scenario, which is sort of interesting. So gives us a good fix to our main anchor ride and helps us get this thing up and running here soon, since this is probably our big money maker, and kind of probably will remain our big money maker for the entire scenario. Now we've got to reconnect the pathway over here, which is a little bit challenging because we actually have this diving corner here, and the trouble with the inverts, just like the suspended, is that it's a 3 height clearance issue. So initially I dropped this in there, which I was kind of cheating initially to lower some landscape there with the 0 clearances on pulled out, so I didn't have to remove sections of the coaster again, just to help ease our time frame with this. But as it turns out, the little pathway that I built there doesn't actually fit with clearances. We're going to find that out here in just a minute, and we're going to fix it, because I do want to at least build it correctly. So here's where we kind of realize that this is not actually correct. And we can go in there with our pathway and adjust it a little bit. We're going to adjust it by actually going into a tunnel and then out onto the other side. So kind of a neat little interactive element there. I really do like this rock outcropping in the pathway that kind of cuts in and out of it. I always liked this layout in Mel's World. This is one of my, I guess one of my favorite scenarios when I was first playing the game, because it had interesting layouts and things, and it was sort of the first cool attempt at layouts after Diamond Heights. Like, I really don't think Carts and Coasters had good layouts, but this one, you know, even though they weren't good, they were different in my opinion. So that's kind of what I liked about it. So it's nice to see something like this for the first time since, I guess, Diamond Heights. So from one B&M to another, we did unlock the vertical drop coaster, and that's what we're going to build. Feels like this plaza up front needs something to bolster it a little bit, and I've already got a couple of these thrill rides there at the corner with the S&S tower and the top spin, so we might as well add a third thing to that area there and let us build something like this. The trouble with the RCT1 dive coaster is that it really doesn't have a lot of options to work with. We get a small vertical loop, which is effectively useless, and we have no other inversions. So, since we can't merge or do anything like that, as we would if we were kind of playing the game, normally, not as a scenario playthrough, we've got to pretty much just do something like Oblivion, or in this case, like G5 in Taiwan, which we're going to see the color inspiration come here in just a little bit. But it's worth using the tunnel for the first drop, just because that's one of the very few things you can do to make this thing sort of interesting. So we're going to drop it through this mountainside underneath the pathway and popping out the other side, like you see right there. And then trying to figure out kind of what this plan is. So I'm looking at a few different options to try and end this, including a diagonal brake run here, which doesn't quite want to work. So we're going to play around a little bit more and see what we can do. So thinking through maybe a helix, which would be kind of a neat way to intertwine this vertical drop here, which is what we're going to do. But I don't like just the regular helix. In general, it just doesn't look good, and you don't see those on real coasters terribly often. So we're going to make the helix slightly more interesting by doing a flat corner, then a diving corner, and then a kind of finishing element there. Unfortunately, this fairly limits what we can do from a brake run standpoint. So we are going to just do 2 trains, because we can't really fit a third train on there. I mean, from a gameplay standpoint, yes, absolutely you can. But from a just brake run sizing standpoint, it really doesn't quite work. So we're going to leave it at that and use just the 2, which is a little bit of a shame, because we're going to have a huge line for this thing and could definitely use the capacity, but brake crunch didn't work out, and I didn't want to keep kind of screwing around with it. I think that angle too highlights really well why it was so nice to have the banked corners when we finally got to RCT2, and why it's always kind of hard for me to go back to that here in the original game. But yeah, it is what it is, and that's part of the fun of it. It's that original game aesthetic, I guess. So here we go, changing the colors to G5. If you're not familiar with that, it's the mirror clone of Oblivion that's in Taiwan. I also messed with Flightmare a little bit there, just to see if a different kind of red would look good. And in general, I think the red is much better as it currently is, so we didn't really change that up. The only challenge that I have with differently colored rails, especially with some like this where the yellow is fairly bright, is that it really does kind of stand out. So when we look at all the coasters together, when we kind of zoom out the map, I feel like the vertical drop coaster is just really, really kind of in your face. But it looks good, I think, and it works all right. We're going to play around at this plaza a little bit, because the pathway is kind of getting like spaghetti. There's just a lot of stuff going on in here, and it's a little bit messy just with this whole thing. So we're going to connect up straight across, so then we have all of that working together. Got our subterranean entrance there to the S&S tower, which is kind of what we have to work with right there, but it gives us a little bit of adjustment, and we can kind of slowly make some changes here to get this a little bit cleaner. Could probably still clean it up a little bit. We will look at that a little bit later here too. But now we've got 3 super popular rides kind of in one spot there, so that's always good to have that. Explored the option of a boat hire here for a minute underneath the coaster, but it just was going to be too hard to fit an entrance and exit, pathways and all that, and still have places for the boats to go. So in the end, we decided to pass on that. And now we'll go adjust some of the landscape here just to get the clearances looking better on that coaster, make things look a little more natural, and make it look a little less like we're just using the lands tool to make these landscapes, which is, clearly what they've done, but it is what it is. I kind of understand why they would do it. So we don't have a lot of food on this side, so we'll go ahead and add the burger bar there. As long as I have a burger bar or any kind of a food product and any kind of a drink product, I usually don't research the food stalls, at least not until kind of the very end of the scenario, because really it doesn't need it. Like, it really doesn't matter. I don't think I've really ever gotten the worst food award. As long as you've got the good food and a good drink, you're pretty well covered, and you place enough of these that people can get stuff, then it's generally fine, and the scenarios are short enough that nobody's really going to complain about it in the end. So we're back to our kids area here, and we decided to add a maze because it fills in the space that other things can't really fit into, and it kind of fits that kind of irregular design here fairly well, I think. And it also looks good. I always like the look of the hedge maze just in general. So over on this side, we have unlocked a little bit of space here now, and we have the swinging inverter ship. We're going to do the back-to-back trick here, which is sort of an easy button thing so that we can get ourselves some fairly good soft gas gap and 2 throw rides to add to the space. We can kind of do the mirror image here for the queue and the exits. But it works all right. You know, it's not necessarily my favorite. I've explained before why I don't really like this type of ride, but in the end, it looks all right. Suggestion was red and blue on these, so we're going to end up going with the red and blue look for both these. I always find it hard to color these for some reason, like that weird kind of vertical yellow line that is down the back of these things that we just turned to red. Always just felt kind of strange in general, but you know, it certainly has precedence based on the original Huss Ranger ride. Do a little bit of theming here with our fencing and clean it up just a little bit and put in some landscape changes and everything, and then also some flowers. Just dress it up a little bit because there's really nothing else along this section. I do tend to like to cluster my attractions if I can, but this one just fills in a gap for a fairly long section of pathway that just doesn't have anything. And it also gives us a fairly good throw ride right there by the entrance. We'll toss in a statue there in the plaza because the plaza feels kind of lonely where it's just empty like that. Good line for the inverted coaster, so it means we're doing something right there. We'll relocate that bathroom, and now we can finally connect up and connect over to the swinging ship on this side, so we can kind of do a nice meandering pathway here. And that is loop number 4 in the park, so now we don't have any more dead ends once again. But that is going to end the video for today. Next time we're going to get into a couple of different coasters, and we're going to finish off the scenario. So as always, thank you very much for watching, and we'll catch you in the next one when we finish up Mel's World. Bye now.